I held that flash drive so tight the plastic edge cut into my palm. Standing in a grocery store parking lot in Litchfield, Connecticut, staring at a man I hadn't seen since James's funeral, and the words coming out of his mouth weren't making sense. Gerald Fenton, my late husband's business attorney for 22 years, a man who never once raised his voice in all the depositions I'd watched him give, was shaking. His hand trembled when he pressed that small black rectangle against my skin. "They filed your death certificate 6 days ago, Eleanor. You're legally deceased." I looked at the grocery bags in my cart. I looked at the receipt in my other hand dated today, April 3rd. I looked at Gerald's face and saw something I'd spent 28 years reading in the eyes of witnesses at federal trials. Genuine fear, not for himself, for me. And the thing about hearing you're dead when you're standing upright in a parking lot with a cart full of produce is that your first thought isn't disbelief. Your first thought, if you've spent nearly 3 decades working forensic document examination for the FBI, is who signed it? I took that flash drive home and I hid it in the one place no one in that house would ever look, inside the battery compartment of James's pocket watch. The watch hadn't run since the day he died. I kept it in my nightstand drawer and I wound it every morning out of habit, but I never set the time. It stayed frozen at 4:17 the minute the hospice nurse recorded his passing. Christopher never touched that watch. He said it gave him the creeps. That's the thing about my son. He always had a talent for finding the things that made people uncomfortable and using them. He just never imagined I'd use his discomfort as a hiding place. Let me go back, because if I start with the flash drive, you'll think this is a story about a sudden emergency. It's not. This is a story about a trap that built itself around me so slowly, I almost didn't recognize the architecture, and I should have. I spent my career reading architecture. The architecture of forged documents, fabricated evidence, constructed lies. I could tell you by the pressure of a pen stroke whether a signature was written under duress or copied from a sample. I could identify the chemical composition of ink that had been artificially aged. I testified in 114 federal cases and helped put away people who thought their paperwork was untraceable. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and my son tried to kill me with signatures. James died in May. By July, Christopher was visiting twice a week, which was more than he'd visited in the previous 3 years combined. He sat at my kitchen table with Dina, his wife, and they talked about how worried they were. I wasn't eating enough. I seemed confused. Had I forgotten to pay the electric bill? I hadn't forgotten. I'd set up AutoPay 6 years ago. But Christopher presented a shutoff notice he said he'd found in the mailbox, and when I called the utility company, they confirmed a brief interruption. Someone had canceled my AutoPay. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Then I just felt that first flicker of doubt, that maybe grief was doing something to my mind I couldn't feel from the inside. The concerned visits became stays. Dina started sleeping in the guest room to keep an eye on things. Christopher hired a nurse named Patrice, a quiet woman from Haiti with careful hands and eyes that never quite met mine. And the episodes began. I'd wake from afternoon naps with my head wrapped in fog so thick I couldn't remember what month it was. My evening tea developed a metallic edge I mentioned to Patrice, who touched my shoulder and said grief does strange things to the body's chemistry. I believed her. I had no reason not to. My husband of 41 years had died in the room directly above us. Grief was doing strange things. But here's what grief doesn't do. Grief doesn't fabricate medical records. In August, Christopher sat me down with a folder. Guardianship paperwork. 3 physicians I had never met, never spoken to, never sat across from in an examination room had signed affidavits stating I showed clear signs of early onset dementia. I held those documents in my hands and I felt something colder than grief. I felt recognition. I'd seen fabricated medical affidavits before. I'd authenticated them for juries. The pressure patterns on these signatures were consistent with batch signing. Someone had placed these forms in a stack, and 3 doctors had signed without conducting a single examination. I knew this because I'd spent 28 years knowing exactly this. But I looked at Christopher's face, my son's face, the face I'd held against my chest when he was small enough to carry, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself grief was making me see conspiracies. I signed nothing. But I didn't run. Christopher cut me off from the outside piece by piece. My neighbor Harold, who'd been checking on me weekly since James died, stopped coming. I found out later Christopher had threatened him with trespassing charges and told him I'd been saying disturbing things, that I had documented evidence of decline. The new attorney Christopher hired to update my estate wouldn't return my calls. When I finally reached his secretary, she said she had no record of our previous conversations. My phone calls to old friends started going strange. People seemed cautious, distant. Christopher had been calling them first, I'd learn, expressing concern, planting seeds. Mom's not herself. She's saying things that worry us. We're trying to get her help, but she's resistant. He was salting the earth around me so that by the time I tried to reach out, everyone I reached would already doubt my mind. You don't need to worry about any of this, Mom. That's what he said every time I asked a question about the estate, about the medical records, about why my prescription had already been picked up by my caregiver when I went to fill it myself. You don't need to worry about any of this. He said it with his hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder his father used to rest his head against, and his voice was so gentle and so controlled that for weeks I let those words settle over me like a blanket. You don't need to worry, meaning stop asking, meaning this is handled, meaning you are no longer a person who handles things. That sentence was the lock on every door. Two things broke the spell. The first was Marcus, my grandson. 9 years old with his grandfather's jawline and his father's quick eyes. He came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes and asked why Mommy measured all the rooms and took pictures of Grandma's jewelry for the insurance people. Children don't know what's supposed to be secret. They repeat what they observe with the precision of court reporters and the innocence of someone who doesn't understand the evidence they're delivering. I dried my hands and I kissed his forehead, and something inside me locked into a position it hadn't been in since I retired from the bureau. Operational clarity. The second was the laptop. Christopher left it open on the dining room table while he took a call in the yard. I wasn't snooping. I was clearing dishes. The screen was right there. My own obituary. Drafted, formatted, dated 3 weeks in the future. Cause of death, natural causes following prolonged illness. I read it twice. My hands didn't shake. I want you to understand that. When you've spent your career looking at evidence of crimes committed against people who couldn't defend themselves, and you suddenly find yourself looking at evidence of a crime being committed against you, something happens that isn't panic. It's recognition. Oh, so this is what it looks like from the inside. The obituary was dated April 24th. I found it on April 1st. I had 23 days, and the metallic taste in my evening tea suddenly had a different explanation. I stopped drinking the tea that night. I poured it into a thermos I kept in my nightstand and began storing samples. 28 years of chain of custody training doesn't disappear because you're the victim instead of the examiner. I labeled each sample with date and time and hid them inside a box of James's old tax records in the attic. A box Christopher would never open because numbers bored him the way they'd never bored his father. And then Patrice changed everything. 3 days after I found the obituary, she cornered me in the bathroom, closed the door, put her back against it. Her eyes met mine for the first time since she'd entered this house, and they were full of something I recognized from my years of interviewing cooperating witnesses. The particular terror of someone about to betray the people who control them. She pressed a burner phone into my hand. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I recorded everything. Call that number tonight." I looked at the phone. One contact saved. The name read, "Your lawyer died suspiciously." I looked back at Patrice, and I saw her hands shaking, and I understood two things simultaneously. That this woman had been coerced into participating in my destruction, and that she was risking everything she had to stop it. I learned later that Christopher had discovered Patrice's undocumented immigration status and used it as leverage. "Help us document Mom's decline. Do what we say, or we make a call and you disappear into a system that doesn't care what happens to you." She'd been trapped in this house the same as me. Two women locked in the same cage by the same man, and the only difference was which one of us he called mother. I called the number that night from the bathroom with the shower running. The woman on the other end identified herself as a former colleague from the Bureau, someone I'd worked cases with in the 90s. She'd been contacted by Gerald Fenton after he discovered the death certificate filing. She already had a case number open. She already had agents ready. What she needed was me, alive, coherent, and willing to build the evidence package that would bring this down. And here's where my career saved my life. Because I didn't just know how to run, I knew how to build a case while running. I knew how to preserve evidence under hostile conditions. I knew how to maintain chain of custody in a compromised environment. I knew how to act normal while documenting everything, because I'd spent decades teaching other people how to do exactly that. The next 14 days were the most precisely orchestrated operation of my life. I had 28 years of federal training and 23 days before my own obituary became prophecy. I started with the documents. Every fabricated medical record, every fraudulent affidavit, every piece of guardianship paperwork Christopher had assembled, I photographed in sequence with the burner phone's camera. Metadata intact. Timestamps visible. I did this between 1 and 3 in the morning when Christopher and Dina slept in the guest suite on the opposite side of the house, and Patrice kept watch from the hallway, texting me a single period if she heard movement. The T samples went into a padded envelope addressed to a forensic lab in Virginia, where I'd sent hundreds of samples during my career. Patrice mailed it from a post office in Torrington during a grocery run. No return address. Case number written on the inner seal. I moved money carefully. My treasury bonds were held at a firm James and I had used for decades. I couldn't liquidate without triggering attention, but I could make phone calls confirming that no one except me had authority to access them. 3 of those calls revealed that Christopher had already attempted transfers using a power of attorney I had never signed. I had the firm flag the forgery internally, while allowing Christopher's paperwork to appear still active in their system. Let him think his access was intact. Let him believe the trap was still closed. If you're listening to this right now and you're building your own exit, whether from a spouse, a parent, a child, whether the trap is financial or emotional or both, I want you to hear this. The most dangerous part of leaving is not the moment you walk out the door. It's the days before, when you're smiling at the person who is destroying you while carrying evidence of their destruction in your pocket. The weight of that performance is physical. I lost 6 pounds in 2 weeks. I ground my teeth so hard in my sleep I cracked a molar. And every morning I came downstairs and let Christopher kiss my forehead and said good morning and drank the tea Patrice now prepared from sealed packets she bought herself, tea that tasted like tea and nothing else. The closest I came to being caught was April 12th. Christopher came home early from a sales call and found me in the study. The filing cabinet was open. I had James's pocket watch in one hand and a stack of estate documents in the other. He stood in the doorway, and his eyes moved from the watch to the papers and back to me. "What are you doing, Mom?" My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Inside that watch was the flash drive Gerald had given me. In those papers were originals I'd been photographing for comparison against the forgeries. "Looking for your father's service records," I said. "I want to make sure they're in order for the Veterans Affairs Office." Christopher stared at me for 3 full seconds. Then he softened. "You don't need to worry about any of this." There it was again, that sentence, that lock. But this time I had the key in my hand and he couldn't see it. "You're right," I said. "I don't know what I was thinking." He took the papers from me gently and put them back in the cabinet and locked it with a key he kept on his ring. He didn't notice the copies I'd already made, stored between the pages of a 1987 edition of Moby Dick on the third shelf, a book I knew he'd never open because Christopher never read anything longer than a sales report. April 15th, the second near miss. Dina found Patrice's car parked at the post office during what was supposed to be a pharmacy run. Dina mentioned it at dinner casually, watching Patrice's face. "Funny, I drove past the post office today and saw your car. Mailing something?" Patrice didn't flinch. "Birthday card from my sister in Port-au-Prince," she said. "I try to send them early because the mail takes forever." Dina held her gaze for a beat too long. Then she smiled and went back to her pasta. Under the table, I could see Patrice's knee bouncing. I pressed my foot against hers, a signal that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to us. Hold, hold. We're almost there. The charm offensive came on April 17th. Christopher brought home flowers. He sat with me on the porch and talked about his father, about memories from childhood, about wanting to make sure I was taken care of. His voice cracked when he talked about James. And for one terrible moment, sitting there with the sunset hitting the Connecticut hills, the way it had for 40 years of my marriage, I wondered if I was wrong. If the obituary was just a draft for some kind of insurance purpose, I didn't understand. If the medical records were a misunderstanding. If my son, my boy, was really just trying to help his grieving mother. Then Marcus came outside, and Christopher snapped at him. "Go inside. Daddy's talking," and I saw the way Marcus flinched. The same flinch I'd been perfecting for months, and the doubt evaporated like fog in direct light. April 20th, 4 days before my scheduled death. My former bureau contact confirmed that a federal team was assembled. Patrice's recordings, nearly 70 hours of audio, including a conversation in which Christopher discussed sedative dosages with someone whose voice analysis later matched the hospice director, had been entered into evidence. The 3 physicians who signed the fraudulent affidavits had been identified, and 2 were already cooperating. The death certificate filing was traced to the attorney Christopher had hired, the one whose secretary claimed our conversations never happened. Gerald Fenton's discovery of the filing had been what started everything unraveling, and I later learned that Gerald had died in what was ruled a car accident 2 weeks after pressing that flash drive into my hand. The FBI didn't rule it an accident. But that investigation is still open, so I'll say only this. The attorney who filed my death certificate cooperated very quickly once he understood what the alternative looked like. The night of April 20th, I lay in my bed in the farmhouse where I'd raised my son, where I'd loved my husband, where I'd built a life that someone was now disassembling around me while I breathed. James's pocket watch sat on the nightstand, the flash drive hidden inside it, ticking at nothing because time had stopped for that watch the day he died. I picked it up and held it against my chest, and I said goodbye. Not to James, to the woman I'd been in this house, the trusting mother, the grieving widow, the confused old woman they were building out of paperwork and sedatives. She was useful. She got me through the performance, but I didn't need her anymore. At 3 in the morning on April 21st, I put on dark clothes and walking shoes. I took the pocket watch. I took the thermos of tea samples I'd stored as backup. I took the burner phone and a bag I'd packed inside a suitcase in the attic, a bag containing copies of every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence I'd assembled. I left the rare book collection. I left the furniture James and I had chosen together. I left 40 years of accumulated life in rooms that no longer felt like mine. Patrice was waiting in her car at the end of the driveway with the headlights off. I walked down that gravel path in the dark, the same path I'd walked 10,000 times, and I did not look back at the house. Not because I wasn't sad, because looking back is what they expect you to do, and I was done performing for their expectations. We drove 2 hours to a motel in Vermont that my bureau contact had arranged. Patrice and I didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't saying better. 2 women who had been caged by the same man, driving through dark Connecticut hills toward a state line that meant everything. The motel room was small and smelled like industrial cleaner, and I sat on the bed and put James's pocket watch on the nightstand, and for the first time in months there were no footsteps in the hallway. No voice calling from downstairs, no metallic taste on my tongue, no performance to maintain. I sat in that silence and my hands began to shake. Not from fear, from the sudden absence of fear. My body had been running on cortisol and vigilance for so long that safety felt like withdrawal. I shook for 20 minutes. Patrice sat beside me and said nothing and held my hand, and I let myself shake until my body believed what my mind already knew. I was out, I was alive, and I was about to prove it in the most devastating way possible. Christopher's birthday was April 26th, 2 days after I was supposed to be dead. Dina had planned a party at the farmhouse, my farmhouse, 40 guests. They were going to celebrate in the house they'd stolen from a woman they'd killed on paper. The FBI agreed the timing was perfect. I walked through my own front door at 7:15 in the evening, 40 people in my living room. Catered food on tables I'd bought with James. Dina in a dress I'm fairly certain she purchased with money from my accounts. Christopher holding a glass of champagne, laughing at something someone said, wearing the confidence of a man who believes his problems are solved. I held the falsified death certificate in my right hand and James's pocket watch in my left. Dina saw me first. Her champagne glass hit the hardwood floor, and the sound cut through every conversation in the room. Then Christopher turned. I've studied faces for a living. I've watched defendants in federal courtrooms cycle through emotion when evidence is presented that they believed was destroyed. I've cataloged the micro expressions of people who are watching their constructed reality collapse in real time. My son's face went through disbelief, fury, and then something I'd seen only a handful of times in my career: animal terror, the expression of a predator who suddenly understands he is prey. "Happy birthday, Christopher," I said, and then the agents came through the back door. I spent my career proving dead people were murdered with signatures. I never imagined I'd have to prove I'm still alive to escape my own son. I said that to my reflection in a gas station bathroom during the drive to Vermont, holding Patrice's burner phone, and I say it again now because some sentences are too true to say only once. The aftermath was thorough. Christopher was arrested on 14 federal charges, including elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted guardianship by deception. Dina was arrested on 9. The hospice director's cooperation with prosecutors exposed a network that had targeted elderly patients in 3 states, and 9 additional investigations were opened within 2 months. The 3 physicians lost their licenses. The attorney who filed my death certificate is serving 4 years. Christopher's gambling creditors, who had been patient because they believed an inheritance was coming, became significantly less patient. Dina fled the country before her trial, abandoning Christopher, abandoning Marcus. I petitioned for custody of my grandson and received it without opposition. Dina's absence made certain arguments unnecessary. I donated the farmhouse to a women's shelter. I liquidated everything Christopher expected to inherit. The treasury bonds, the rare books, all of it converted and redirected into trusts he cannot touch, will never touch, controlled by attorneys who answer to me and no one else. I bought a house in Vermont, small, clean, a kitchen with a window that looks out on birch trees. Every drawer in that kitchen contains documents I alone control. My name on every account, my signature on every form, my life in my hands, in my handwriting. 6 months after the arrest, Patrice sent me a photograph. Her standing in a federal building holding a certificate, her citizenship ceremony. She'd been granted legal status as a protected federal witness, and she'd used that protection to complete the process she'd been too terrified to pursue, while Christopher held her immigration status like a weapon. The note on the back of the photograph read, "You gave me my life back by trusting me with yours." I taped it to my refrigerator. It's still there. James's pocket watch sits on my new mantelpiece. I had it repaired. It runs now. I set it to the correct time the day I moved in, and it ticks steadily in a house where no one else has keys. Sometimes I stand in the kitchen and listen to it, and the sound fills the room the way silence used to fill the farmhouse. But this isn't silence. This is time moving forward in a space that belongs to me. I wake up in the morning and I make coffee and I decide what to do with my day, and no one tells me I don't need to worry about any of this. I worry about exactly what I choose. I manage exactly what I please. I am 67 years old, and I am more dangerous than I've ever been, not because I carry anger, but because I carry evidence and I know exactly what to do with it. If someone arranges medical care you didn't request, if doctors you've never met start diagnosing you, if your own obituary exists before you're dead, the predator might share your blood. Studies show that over 60% of elder financial abuse is committed by family members, most commonly adult children, and victims over 65 lose an average of nearly $120,000 before the abuse is even detected. Those numbers are staggering, but they don't capture the thing that makes this crime unique. They don't capture the specific violation of being hunted by someone who learned to walk in your kitchen. They don't capture the way "I love you, Mom" becomes camouflage for theft, for fraud, for something darker than either. If you're planning your exit right now, in silence, while performing compliance for someone who controls your life, I want you to know that your planning is not paranoia. Your secrecy is not dysfunction. Your patience is not weakness. It is strategy. It is the same strategy that kept me alive. Document everything. Store copies outside the home. Tell one person you trust completely. And when you move, move with the precision of someone who understands that freedom is not given. It is engineered. Marcus is 10 now. He lives with me. He's in 4th grade at a school where his teachers know him as a bright, quiet boy who likes dinosaurs and is learning to trust adults again. Last Tuesday, he came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and asked if he could wind Grandpa's watch. I showed him how. He held it to his ear and smiled at the ticking and said it sounds like a heartbeat. I told him it was. He doesn't know the full story. He'll know it when he's old enough to understand that the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes become the people you need protection from, and that surviving that particular betrayal requires a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength at all. It looks like patience. It looks like silence. It looks like an old woman drinking tea and smiling and saying good morning while carrying the evidence of her own attempted murder inside a dead man's pocket watch. I'm listening from my kitchen in Vermont. The birch trees are bare right now, but they'll leaf out in May. James's watch is ticking on the mantelpiece. Patrice's photograph is on the refrigerator. The drawers are full of documents with my name on them. My real name, alive and legal, and mine. Where are you listening from? And if you recognize something in this story, not the specifics, but the architecture, the slow construction of a cage built from love and obligation and paperwork, how would you prove you're still alive when everyone profits from your death? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe if this found you at the right time. And if you're planning, keep planning. Your exit is coming. Make it clean, make it complete, make it yours.